If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. Today, Sonia is interviewing John about the apparent contradiction in the Bible regarding the year of Jesus' birth. Matthew tells us Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, who, we are told, died in 4 BC, while Luke tells us Jesus was born during a census conducted when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and we are told that this man did not govern until AD 6. Can these assertions be reconciled? It will take several episodes to cover this topic, so if any episode ends with the contradiction still being unresolved, never fear. Tune in to a subsequent episode to find out this challenge addressed in full. If you miss any episodes, you can find them in our podcast. See truthinmydays.com for the location. We hope you enjoy the series.
So having answered those charges that are brought against this story and shown that they are without foundation, let's return to the issue of the census of Quirinius. Now, we're told that according to Josephus, Quirinius the governor conducted a census for taxation in the year AD 6. Now, if Luke 2:2 is translated as this registration was before Quirinius was governor of Syria, there's no supposed contradiction. It can certainly legitimately be translated that way, unless you're following the critical Greek text, as most evangelical scholars do, and most modern translations of the Bible do. In that case, as Daniel Walsh pointed out, pretty much impossible to translate it that way. This is an example of the problem that textual criticism leads into when it comes to biblical inerrancy, but we'll discuss that in detail in other programs. Right now, we can say that, in fact, the text as we have it can be translated legitimately. This registration was before Quirinius was governor of Syria, and the problem is solved. But we can also point out that even if Josephus is correct, it actually does not rule out an earlier registration conducted by him somewhere in 3 to 2 BC. But here's the thing. We're told that if it's 3 to 2 BC, is there a reason to believe that Quirinius was governor of Syria in 3 to 2 BC? Well, if we look carefully at the wording of Luke 2:2, we read, this census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. Now, if you look at the actual Greek, what do you see there, Sonia?
A genitive absolute. Hegemon nuontos, genitive present participle.
Participle, exactly. So what would that mean then?
When you have this kind of construction, we often will translate as some kind of adverbial clause, but you have to use your judgment as to what kind. Like, is it just temporal, when? Is it causal, because? Is it concessive, although, and so on? Yeah.
In this case, New King James translates it as this census first took place while Quirinius was hegemon nuontos, governing Syria. It doesn't actually say he was the governor. It doesn't say he had the title. What is the meaning of this particular verb we're looking at? Hegemonuo.
According to the lexicon, to exercise an administrative position, be leader, command, rule, order.
Yeah, so it has to do with him doing something rather than having a specific title. What we see in Luke 2:2 doesn't mean that Quirinius necessarily had the formal title of governor, but only that he was commanding or exercising official authority. Now, from the historical records that we do have of Quirinius, what was he doing during this time? The Cambridge Ancient History, Volume 10, tells us that each province had its equestrian procurator, who in the eyes of the provincials was almost as important as the governor himself. So each province actually had a procurator as well as a governor. John Thorley, When Was Jesus Born, in the journal Greece and Rome, 2nd series, tells us that Quirinius was actually procurator of Syria, based on what Justin Martyr in Apology 1.34 tells us. He says that the imperial records stated that Quirinius was procurator of Syria, not governor.
Okay, what's a procurator?
Procurator was one of the two people appointed as authorities. Pontius Pilate, you recall, was procurator of Judea. So there's difference in titles, but not really difference in function. Both of them exercised official authority. So both of those could be considered to be doing the hegemonuo, okay? Because that's a verb, it's not a title. So there's no problem about Quirinius not being the governor at the time, as long as he is governing or exercising authority in official capacity. And he did that. In addition to being procurator at that time, all the way from 12 BC, he was a consul. He was the supreme military commander of the eastern provinces. He seemed to be a troubleshooter for Rome, given a special command to prosecute the Homonadensian War between 10 and 5 BC. Apparently did it very well. Later assigned as guardian to Gaius Caesar, heir to the throne. So there's no problem seeing him exercising his authority and given the command to carry out this registration.
Oh, so that should be enough to solve the whole problem then.
Well, it does. So if we sum up what we've seen so far, the charge that Matthew and Luke contradict each other about the birth of Jesus, as Matthew has it happen before Herod's death in 4 BC, while Luke has it at the time that Quirinius was governor of Syria. That didn't happen until AD 6. We've seen that none of those claims, none of the elements is actually true. The evidence is rather conclusive that Herod died in 1 BC, not 4 BC. We saw that the data in Josephus has to actually be tortured to get a 4 BC date. At best, some of them will point to 1 BC, some might point to 3 BC, but there's no lunar eclipse in 3 BC, so they had to draw back 1 year earlier to make it 4 BC, so that's not what Josephus says. And the only lunar eclipse in 4 BC was too faint to have been noted. The only thing that seemed to carry any weight was that his sons seemed to count their reigns from 4 BC, but Josephus tells us that they were already kings before Herod died, so that last objection to dating Herod's death to 1 BC disappears. We saw that there were claims that there was no worldwide census ordered by Caesar at the time of Jesus' birth, and had there been one, Joseph would not have been required to travel to Bethlehem, and Mary also would not have had to go with him. We saw that every one of these claims are bogus. We saw that the decade, well, Roman history in general, is not nearly as well recorded, as complete as we would like. And this decade in particular was so poorly recorded that the absence of evidence for any specific event in that period cannot be considered significant. Even so, we saw there several lines of evidence that indicate that there was, in fact, an empire-wide registration for an oath of loyalty in 3 to 2 BC, which fits the biblical timeline for the birth of Jesus perfectly. We saw it reasonable that those who had royal ancestry, such as both Joseph and Mary did, may well have been required to go to their royal ancestral hometowns for the registration so that the authorities could know who had a potential claim to the throne. We can't prove that for a fact, but then it's being set against an argument from silence anyway. And then we saw finally that there's reason to believe that Quirinius may indeed have been governing in 3 to 2 BC, specifically perhaps acting on a command to conduct the registration. At any rate, he was there. Now, let's suppose you're the liberal skeptic. Let's suppose he wants to ignore all of this and still insist that Luke is contradicted by Josephus. Well, as we pointed out earlier, it becomes a question of who is the more reliable historian, Luke or Josephus. And we've already amply shown how Luke is an extremely accurate historian. He is in the very forefront of ancient historians. Sir William Ramsay tells us that from his decades of investigation in the Holy Land, which means that even initially we should prefer his testimony over that of Josephus, because Josephus was not nearly as careful an historian. And something particularly interesting about Josephus' occasional carelessness, a scholar named John H. Rhodes did a very interesting analysis of Josephus. It was published in Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, volume 54, number 1, in the year 2011. Now, he wasn't trying to vindicate Luke at all. He was simply doing a study of source criticism of Josephus. In other words, analyzing the sources he used, since he was not himself an eyewitness, not to these events. And he makes this claim: Josephus misstated the census of Quirinius. And that's the whole basis of this charge, that Luke got the date of Quirinius wrong because it disagrees with Josephus. And here are scholars telling us Josephus was wrong about the date of the census.
Okay, but John, you're always telling us that we can't just believe what a scholar says because he's a scholar and that they must provide evidence. Did Daniel Schwartz provide any evidence?
Indeed he does. That's a good point to make. We always insist there has to be evidence. Let's look at the evidence for this. Now, first, here's what he points out. During the last 25 years, Daniel Schwartz and others have developed some fruitful insights into the historiography of Josephus, which have highlighted the susceptibility of Josephus to mistaken duplications and to reporting contemporaneous events from different sources as if they happened at different times. The account which Josephus tells of the census conducted by Quirinius and the corresponding revolt by Judas the Galilean is actually one of these, a mistaken duplication, broadly speaking, of events which occurred much earlier. The census began before Herod's death. Well, why is it a mistaken duplication? Because Josephus describes an earlier census, supposedly done by Sabinus. And here's the problem. When you compare Josephus' account of this first census in his book with what he puts as a second census under Quirinius, if we would believe that these are two different censuses, we would have to believe this. We would have to believe that two insurgents against Herod were active within weeks of each other around the time of Herod's death. We'd have to believe that both of these insurgents were named Judas. Both were connected with Sepphoris, a city near Nazareth. Both were nicknamed in connection with a famous father. One was executed by Herod the Great for raiding Herod's temple, and the other waited 10 years after raiding Herod's armory to adopt the same manner and substance of teaching as the first. We would have to believe that the second was opposed by the very same high priest who had opposed the earlier Judas, even though this high priest was reportedly deposed twice during those 10 years. So you'd have all these amazing coincidences. The similarity between Sabinus and Quirinius in both title and activity must be just as coincidental as he refers to another example of Josephus taking two different accounts of one event and thinking that they're two different events, Judas and Joazar.
Okay, so how do we know that the Quirinius one is the mistake then and not the Sabinus one?
The point is that this is clearly a repeat of an earlier one. He's taken, unless we think that all of these things happen exactly in these coincidental fashions, he described an earlier census, one that was done while Herod was still alive, and then, based perhaps on a different account of it, he repeats exactly the same thing.
But how do we know which of the two is the right one?
It doesn't matter. The point is we have, as we've seen, other evidence that the biblical date for the census is right. So if Josephus has two that are clearly two, one is a mistaken one, then if we decide which one, it's based on the other evidence we've already seen that puts the census to 3-2 BC. It would make no sense to simply, well, let's assume he got the second one right and not the first one. We'll assume that in order to set that against the actual evidence we've seen in order to keep trying to say that Luke got it wrong. There'll be no evidence for that assumption. So, the conclusion of all this, then, is that the charge that there's an irreconcilable contradiction between Matthew and Luke regarding the birth date of Jesus is nonsense. Luke's testimony of a worldwide registration in 3-2 BC is fully consistent with the evidence we have, and this occurred before Herod's death in 1 BC. And this is why we need elite-level apologetics to answer even the supposedly most intractable problems as we've done here. We need to stop listening to people who just give in and accept liberal presuppositions without question. We need to take inerrancy seriously.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com.